Excellent. While all the rest will come in, we'll do the introduction so that as more people come in, they can come in on the fruitful, exciting stuff. And so if you just want to go next slide, Ruth. Excellent. So as a quick introduction, if you don't know who I am yet, I'm from MindMuse. We help provide essentially your digital sidekick in the psychosocial space. If you, the HR leader, you're trying to make the business case, a low resource team who doesn't have the internal capacity, or a consultant who wants to enhance their quality. Then we usually also have, if you want to go next slide, please. We also bring these webinars. It's also new for Michael Safety Guard and all the incredible expertise and on-the-ground stories which she brings. Really fantastic that we've been able to come together and bring this series to life. And of course, today we are really excited to have our first guest to this webinar series. So really appreciate, Ruth, all the effort you've done. Particularly, so the way we split up these webinars, if you're new to it, is looking at from a team, individual, team, organizational, and then integrating the whole psychosocial aspects. And we really appreciate the role of the individual side and the stories of the individual side, and the importance of so recognizing well-being as part of the whole journey. And I'm particularly keen to hear and learn from all Ruth's work. So Ruth is an award-winning coach and trainer and has really done so much in this space, particularly now with Sunrise Well. So we really want to give her the space and highlight the good work she's doing and learn from it. So I'll pass it off to you now, Ruth. But in the duration of the webinar, if any of you have questions, feel free to send it through in the chat. I'll manage it. I'll get to it at the end, unless it's something which flows in organically. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy it. All right.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Felix, for introducing me. Yes, today I want to talk to you about going beyond compliance and, really looking at how we can build up the buffer for psychosocial risk. So I have a lot I want to talk about, but we're going to try to keep it within the, 20, 30 minutes that we've got. And hopefully I give you some, nuggets to take away with the work that you're doing. So firstly, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm joining you from, the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And what I want to talk to you about is, first of all, I guess making some assumptions here. So when I'm talking to you with a really short time frame and not knowing who you are very well, I'm going to make some assumptions around the fact that you may be a consultant or you may be juggling more than one role. There may be HR people and WHS people here. There's a whole variety of different people. And then within that, we're going to have people at different stages of the journey. There may be some people who feel like they're not even on top of the basics yet, the compliance side of things, and just really getting their heads around what it's all about. So I want to sort of acknowledge that and talk about this as being a piece of the puzzle that you're putting together for your organization. And what I hope is that you use this, like I said, as food for thought, that you take away and apply to your broader organizational plan and strategy, and remembering that this is just that small piece. So hopefully you can take that message away with you. And I guess the one key message I have for you is that we have preventing harm, but we also have building human capacity, and these are two different things. And so I want to look at how we do these and how we can, bridge that gap and join them together when you're planning out your strategies. So Felix did a great introduction for me. There's some more information about me. I've worked with lots of organizations across APAC, and my background's generally public health, psychology, mindfulness, advanced training, and an advanced or award-winning health coach, and also partner a lot with Medibank. So I really enjoy the work I do. I absolutely love it. And, when this topic has been evolving, it's been such an interesting conversation to be a part of. So today what we're going to be looking at is, how can we go beyond that tick and flick compliance side of things. What does it mean to build that foundation as a preventative measure? We're going to look at a little bit at the science of strength, and I'm going to introduce or talk to you a little bit about job demands and resources, proactive vitality management, and psychological safety as some of the core foundations to be thinking about. And I'm going to show you a little case study from my own work and also some of the core research that's coming out around psych safety. And then, some practical strategies. So what are you actually going to do? How do we apply this when Monday rolls around? I also invite you to please share your own thoughts, ideas, and experiences in here because, as I said, this is a journey that everybody's on and people are at different stages. And I think it really helps if you have a think about, well, where am I at with this? And perhaps you can, if you want to put a question in about what's going on for you, or just sharing some of the insights around some things that you're seeing or some questions that are coming up for you. I think it's not only helpful for you to open up that discussion, but I think it also opens up the discussion for other people to apply some of those ideas and learnings to their own experiences and examples. So let's treat this more as I'm not the expert, but we're all just sharing the ideas here and coming further along in creating the solutions. So a lot of organizations right now are focusing on the compliance side. There's a lot of interest in that, obviously, and there's a lot of push for that, and that we really need to make sure that we're looking at that top tier of things like the hazard identification, policy procedures, incident reporting, compliance, etc., and also using EAP programs, though you can see in brackets I've put that that's a little bit of a reactive strategy. But we do know that we have these and we need to make sure that we focus on these. So if this is the area that you're focusing on right now, perfect, because that's where you should be focusing a lot of your attention on. But we also don't want to overlook, the other areas that can support your strategy. And sometimes these are a little bit overlooked or potentially disregarded because they may not fit into that broader compliance framework at this point in time. But I think we're going to see as this conversation matures that we're going to see an incorporation of those on the right-hand side a lot more readily and a lot more carefully considered in coming years. So things like understanding and reinforcing the job demands, resources, psychosafety, team culture, proactive vitality management, leadership, wellbeing capability. This is a really big one. And I think that we're going to see a lot happening in this space just around leadership understanding what wellbeing is all about and how to actually proactively manage that. And then, of course, finding meaning and connection in the work and how to actually help people to flourish in their work. Understanding that all of this works together. So the reason that we really want to incorporate them from the beginning is that we want to provide that safety net where we are being proactive rather than reactive. We want to really look at, and this obviously it fits in as well with the legislative requirements in being proactive in your control measures, to have a think about, well, how can I actually make this move beyond the well-being fluff that, has been a little bit of the conversation lately into feeding into and supporting my overall broader strategy. So my first question to you really is, how far upstream are you when you're doing this work? And I think this is a question we have to continually ask, not just ask once and say, yep, I've ticked it all off and I'm all good. So you've probably heard this saying before from Desmond Tutu. It's been one of my favorite sayings since public health, since I began public health years and years ago. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. So when we apply that concept, when we think about, okay, why are people falling in? Yes, we understand that there are people burning out. We need to understand what's going on with the job design, what's going on with the workload, and also assisting people to not just fall in the river and then fish them back out again, or fall in the river, an incident takes place, and then we throw an EAP at them. So what can we do to help them? What lifeboats are we giving them to prevent them from falling in the river? But then if they do fall in the river, helping them to survive that. So thinking about it from that point of view, this is, I guess, something that I ask people to always keep in the back of their minds. And what we also want to do there is have a think about how we're measuring this, right? So when we are figuring out, okay, what approach are we going to take? We want to use measurements and we want to be able to gather data together. Now, you can use a lot of the great tools out there, but you can also use your internal tools to help you to shape what the picture looks like. So if you're being predictive, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about being predictive soon so that you can try to predict what's going to happen based on the data that you have. If you're doing that, you can go through things like your absenteeism records, your engagement surveys, of course, your EAP data, your complaints, your turnover, your exit interviews, your workers' compensation claims, to help you to paint a picture of what's gone on in the past, of course, your safety data as well. Painting a picture of what's gone on in the past to help you to predict some of the things that are going to happen into the future. So that's one way to help you to be preventative, alongside many other ways in order to monitor what's going on. So what's going on when we're talking about strengthening? Now, I'm just going to talk here around the individual control, so that lower level, lower order in the hierarchy. But when we're looking at this, let's have a think about, what does individual and PPE actually mean? So I like to think of the analogy when we're thinking about physical health and safety. When somebody is confronted with an environmental risk, let's say, for example, a high level of noise in which needs to be protected against, we do, of course, look for ways to reduce the risk of the machine, and we look for ways to move the worker away from that machine. But we also have them put on headphones or earphones that protect them from that noise before it even happens, right? They're wearing those earphones way before the noise begins. And it's part of their protective equipment that they have this as their factor, as their protection. We don't wait until the noise starts and then throw them some headphones and say, here you go, good luck with that, right? We've done this prediction, and we've done this I guess a little bit of trial and practice, so that we can realize, or we understand over time, we've adapted to understand we better wear headphones or earphones, whatever they're called, in this place, in this environment. We have to always have that protective gear on. But we're not doing that yet with psychological safety in terms of the individual. We're not really looking at ways to act proactively. And so this is something I'm really, really interested in. How can you be proactive with that? So as an example here, number one, the risk with PPE is that we have the individual strengthening brought in too late and it becomes very reactive. You have an example where you've had reports of bullying, and so you decide to do your training on communication skills. So that's way too late. The injury's already occurred, and obviously all of those controls should have been dealt with a long time earlier. As I said, I'm not talking here about the other factors in terms of the hierarchy, but when we're talking about the individuals and the teams, we can be building in those strengths a lot earlier. We cannot necessarily eliminate the bully, right? There's a lot going on there with the bully and the psychological history of the person who is involved in the bullying. But there is an opportunity there to build up people's ability to communicate better or remove themselves from those harmful situations. But that doesn't happen when the incident happens. It needs to happen a lot earlier. So that's my main message there. The other part of this is the human in the equation. And this is the tricky part. This is an extremely difficult place to tease out. How do we differentiate the human when we're bringing in these controls? So when we, for example, make a workload adjustment for fatigue, perhaps that we want to ensure that we're managing fatigue for people, and so we're adjusting the workload, but we forgot to, or we didn't realize that it didn't really make that much of an impact because of the personal things going on for that person. They may have a newborn at home. They may have personal relationship things going on. There's all these factors outside of work that can be happening. You kind of think, well, that's not really the organization's responsibility. And in some respects, no, it's not. But a person who is fatigued is a person who is fatigued. The same thing happens regardless. And when they are fatigued, they still have poor health, poor communication. Relationships can break down. They can make mistakes on the job and all that sort of thing. So going in and helping people to address that is going to have better effects for the organization in general. Of course, teasing out the roles and responsibilities there is a tricky one. It's an extremely tricky one. And this is a tricky issue. And I think when we think about psychosocial risk management, we really need to consider it as something that's not easy to, it's not easy to just tick and flick something like this. It should be a working live assessment and a working live conversation and document. So the question I have for you is, I'm sure you've got great policies and procedures in place. Sorry, I'll come back. Somebody said here, Deb, you've asking what PVM is. I'm going to talk about PVM very, very soon, but that's proactive vitality management. That's what it stands for. So hopefully that helps. So when we talk about PPE for physical risks, I'm sure you have great policies and documents in place. When do you provide PPE for the psychological risks? This is the question that I sort of want you to take away and think about. Feel free to, put your own thoughts and insights into the chat as well. So how much planning ahead, how much projection are you able to do around that? And I think what we really also need to understand is, as organizations are grappling with this, is not going to be a clean transition or a clean or straightforward process. I think we need to get messy in the middle here a little bit to try to figure this out. We do have a lot of solutions, but it's going to take time for you and your organization to be able to become clear around what exactly works for you and how you're going to do that, how you're going to put it together. So now I'm going to talk a little bit around some of these different resources that are there to support you. So the job demands and resources model is a very robust framework that's been validated across hundreds of studies across many countries. And basically what we're looking at here is that when the demands of the job outstrip the resources available to people, people experience stress and burnout and disengagement. But when the resources are strong relative to the demands, people can cope and potentially flourish. So when we look at the job demands, these of course correlate a lot with the psychosocial risk list that you've probably got somewhere nearby. Things like the high workload, time pressure, ambiguous roles and conflict, interpersonal conflicts, and of course the arising of potential bullying. Poor change management is another really big one. Lack of control and autonomy, and the physical and emotional demands of work. The job resources that we can look at are things like the leadership support, the autonomy, the ability to make work meaningful and to have a sense of purpose in work, the team cohesion, team connection, the building of trust, and that's where psychological safety plays a big role. And just to point out very quickly, hopefully you know the difference between psychological safety and psychological health and safety. So just to point out, when I'm talking about psychological safety, I'm talking about the trust between team members to be able to voice concerns or air ideas or any issues safely without any repercussions. So that's what I'm talking about with psychological safety. Being able to have good positive feedback, clear feedback, good recognition programs, the development of skills, and psychological safety. So these are, when we're looking at things from a job demands and resources point of view, we are not just asking what are the hazards, we're also asking what are the resources and are these strong enough to buffer against the demands that we have alongside the organizational changes that we are making. And also, I think it's a good time to point out the other tricky part of this problem, which is the individual differences between people. So when I'm presented with a stressful situation, I'm not just dealing with it as some kind of empty automaton. I'm coming to the tricky and challenging situation or stressful situation with my stress levels as they are at this point in time, my coping strategies right now, my previous exposure to trauma, various social support around me, my window of tolerance that is built up over time, my past experiences, etc., etc., etc. So my experience of a stressful situation is very different often to your experience of a stressful situation. So when we are managing these things, we're not always able to find that um, blanket program that is going to suit every single person. And I think it's worth just voicing that right now. Now, proactive vitality management, Deb, I hope this explains it a little bit better for you. Proactive vitality management is fairly recent and comes from positive psychology and occupational health. And really what we're looking at here is where traditional stress management tends to be a little bit more reactive. So it comes up when the incidents are occurring. What we're using with proactive vitality management is helping people to proactively build the conditions and the resources within to have sustained energy and engagement over time, regardless of what's going on. So through the troughs and peaks of work and life, and the resources are there for people to be able to adapt. Again, I'm just going to point out this does not replace making organizational changes that are 100% necessary, but they are supportive buffers for people who need that support over time. So we've got the 6 different areas. Energy management. So this is helping people to understand how to manage their energy, just the basic education and understanding there. Job crafting. So looking at role design, and that obviously is a part of, organizational strategy. Helping people to proactively build support and seek the resources for the feedback and support that they need. Activating their strengths, so working towards building strengths and understanding people's strengths in order to create higher levels of engagement. And recovery practices. So recovery practices, we're looking at the rituals. These are the rituals outside of work and inside of work that allow you to connect with other people, but also allow you to detach from work when you're not there. And growth orientation. So helping to reframe the demands into opportunities. And so some cognitive reappraisal going on there. So what I suggest is that you look at your programs and your resources around these 6 areas and think about how can you build in these 6 areas into your programs as a way of buffering the psychosocial risk. So just helping people to build up that strength. As I said, throwing in a resilience training at the last minute when an incident occurs is can often be counterintuitive. But doing this early and helping to build up those strengths as just a general BAU, this is where it can be effective. So choosing the right place, and the right thing to be using is super important. So just as an example of job demand resources and something like mindfulness, because that mindfulness has had a bit of a rough road in the last couple of years, because throwing a mindfulness app at people when they are burning out is probably the worst thing you could be doing. But it doesn't counter the good research out there that shows that it can be a positive independent variable that can support people from and reduce burnout. So this is based on, I'll just get the information here, Liddy et al., and you can find the resource at the end, the reference for this. They conducted twin, 2-wave and 3-wave studies of employees. This was in Finland and the US with very large groups. We had 800 in one of the groups and around the same for the other group. So pretty large and good sample size. And what they found is that mindfulness doesn't, and this is a mindfulness practice that they followed people over an 8-week to 10-week period. It didn't just help people to cope with the stress, it actually changed the way that they experienced their jobs. So it helped them to perceive their jobs with lower job demand and lower emotional strain. And they were able to increase their resources. So there was a sense of significance and meaning in their work that increased over time as they had this practice. So this then led to lower levels of burnout and higher engagement. And this was followed up 6 months later, and I think another 12 months later to reinforce and make sure that this lasted a long time. So rather than sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I think it's just, as I said, less about throwing away the sort of the wellbeing initiatives, but making sure that they actually fit at the right place in the right time. Now, just quickly on a case study, I want to show you, this is a company I worked with last year. They were going through 6 to 12 months of upheaval, which, maybe 5, 10 years ago would have just been upheaval without much support. But these days, people are taking it a lot more seriously. So they were going through a huge system upgrade through a merger, and they were making quite a large number of people redundant, mostly because of changes with technology and AI. So I wasn't across the entire change management process, but they brought me in on the wellbeing aspect. And what I worked on was what you can see in green. So I did the stress management training. I helped them to understand and manage and cope with change, managing their own wellbeing with change, and the leadership capability, because these leaders are not only going through change themselves, but they're supporting other people who have to also go through changes and the uncertainty there. So I was brought in from the beginning before anything was announced. So we were across it all together as a team 6 months prior to any of the large announcements. And this is where they started the change process. They started with the well-being of people way before any of the large announcements were made, so that they knew they were equipping people early before bringing in all of these big changes, because, some of these things are inevitable. The things in orange were done outside of my scope. So access to EAP, consultation, co-design, and of course, career transition support. So I just wanted to give you an example of what that can look like in action. Just quickly on the wellbeing lab. So this is the psych safety research. There were 1,000 workers. This was actually done by a Brisbane local, Michelle McCade. And they basically found 3 findings. Workers with high psychological safety experienced fewer experiences, of every single one of the 15 measurements of psychosocial hazards. And what they're looking at here is that psychological safety really helps to buffer the burnout. The main point being it's not going to eliminate the risks, but it is going to buffer the burnout. So what we're looking for here is building up that team level buffer where possible. And I just want to make sure that everybody has some time to ask questions. So I'm just going to skip through just to point out some of the things you can be doing. So individual level, team level, and organizational level, there are a number of different things you can do up there on the screen. So looking at proactive vitality management and self-awareness for the individual, looking at how you can build up psychological safety for the teams, and of course your organizational frameworks that you're working on also. So just to wrap up, what do you think one thing is that you could do to build more strength, both in yourself, your team, or your organization? This is something I'd love you to take away and think about. And I'm just going to open up for questions now. There's a quick tool you're welcome to grab from me, which is a sample team building tool, basically to help you to build up that team psychological safety and understanding of their energy management. So feel free to grab that. And I'm going to wrap up. Thank you, Felix. And open up to questions.
Thank you for the wrap up, Ruth. That was excellent. I think there was lots of key points in that.
It was a lot.
It was
I
a
know.
lot. If you were to summarize what you would want people to take away in 1 or 2 sentences, just cautious of time, what would you wrap it up as?
I think I would say that it's going to take time, perhaps, to get across all of this, but be wary of, and perhaps have conversations across HR, WHS, and leadership, bringing people together to find what resources you have to be able to control these measures, control these risks, but also to think about how you can do this proactively, especially on the individual and team level.
I've just sent through your details as well. I hope you're comfortable with me sharing them in case
Yeah,
anyone
yeah,
wants to reach out
that's
to you as
fine.
well with further questions. I know we are at time, so thank you everyone for joining us, particularly to this point. We'll respond by emails with any of the other questions as well, which would have come through. And oh yes, and feel free to email us if you do have questions as well, and we can pass it on, or you can reach out to Ruth personally too. But thank you all for joining us.
Thank
The
you.
next webinar in a fortnight time, we'll be moving on to, I believe, looking at a story within the Teams level in the psychosocial space. And then we'll be continuing with our series, but lots to unpack here. And we'll follow up with a with a summary and recording if anyone wants that too.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Bye.